Good morning, my friends. Today, it's another gray, cloudy day. A little bit of rain. Nothing new or special. Pretty much the same as it's been the past, month or so. So today I have work later tonight. Um, I'm actually I'm not looking forward to it, but I'm very comfortable with the fact that I just have work tonight. It's not anything that I'm particularly feeling strongly in one way or the other towards. It's just a state of mind. Usually I would be kind of like, oh, I have work later. Oh, I don't really want to go to work today. Today I'm just kind of like, oh, I have work tonight. It's not a big deal. I really have no problems working at this job, especially on weekdays. Weekdays it's not so busy. During the weekend I'm kind of nervous because I never really know if it's going to be a quiet night. It's getting quieter as winter approaches, but during the weekends it's usually pretty busy and it gets pretty stressful at times, especially when I'm simultaneously having to work the cash and then wash the dishes and go back and forth. And sometimes there's just an endless stream of people, and then you start running out of dishes, you start running out of forks and knives, and you have to go back and forth and clean dishes, but you don't have enough time. It's just very stressful, and it makes me kind of annoyed, especially when people are asking very repetitive questions. But that's aside from the point. Today, I'm going to be talking about the concept of cultural appropriation. This is a big thing that's been happening a lot around the world, not around the world, I should say, specifically in the first world countries, specifically North America. Everywhere else in the world doesn't seem to be much of a problem. It's mostly a first world kind of problem that's sort of happening around here. For what reasons? It's obviously towards minorities who feel like their culture is sort of taken away from them when they're living in the United States or in Canada, and they feel that when white people specifically are utilizing that culture for themselves, it's an inherently negative aspect on them. I'm going to be talking about this in different lights, different concepts. So, if we were to look at cultural appropriation from the sense that you have white people taking culture, let's say, or removing culture from these minorities, so to speak, and then you have other white people dressing like them. Okay, there's different kinds of white people, obviously. The people that you are blaming or that are at fault here for taking away culture or dismantling culture generally don't appropriate those cultures. They definitely don't really respect or even admire or regard those cultures as even existing for the most part. They're generally the very white collar, slick back kind of people who are very rigid in their own, let's say, white culture, so to speak. These are the people that if you're going to be mad about, these are the people you should be mad about. There's another question of where people have Halloween costumes that are made to basically make fun of other people's cultures, which I agree is not a exactly tasteful Halloween costume. It's definitely a joke that's going against somebody else's culture, something that they might wear for religious reasons or whatnot, and it's just making fun of people based off how they dress. That's also a very negative concept to think about, but that's generally not what people get mad about. I mean, that doesn't really happen that often, especially nowadays. It still happens from time to time, and even if I go into a Halloween costume store and I see something that's sort of like a caricature of like a Native American headdress, so to speak, it's a little bit off-putting. But I'm not gonna ban the store or picket the store or shame anyone for doing that, because that's taking something that's already kind of negative and then making it even worse in that situation, which is what I find a lot of what's happened in these cultural appropriation call-outs that seem to be happening. One of the biggest things is the dreadlocks, white people wearing dreadlocks, which I don't really have an opinion about because I'm not black. some people, some white people have curly hair, and sometimes they just don't wash their hair for whatever reason, and it just dreads naturally, and that's just kind of what happens. And when they grow out their hair dreads naturally, and they're criticized for it, which I kind of have a problem for, because it's not a cultural thing in that case. It's just an effect that happens to your hair depending on how you wear it, depending on how long it is, etc. So these are kind of like little things that happen, which I feel like are unwarranted. And even if you do see someone who's wearing dreads that you find is offensive, these aren't the people that are taking away your culture. It's the other people. You have to think about it. It's the other people that are sort of regarding dreadlocks as being ugly or not, important in society, or whatever the thing is. I'm not really that much of an expert on the dreadlock phenomenon, which is why I don't really have much of an opinion on it, because it doesn't affect me. I know that if there are things that do affect me, someone's making fun of Jewish people, which is the only thing that I can really identify with as a minority, really. I don't get bothered by it. It's not really my place to be bothered. I don't really care about that kind of thing, because, even though people might be trying to take away my culture, so to speak, I don't really care about my culture, in the sense that I care about the morality of that culture, and of my, specifically my family. I think the family is the real integral part of the culture, which I think people are angry about, is that the family dynamic doesn't have that same unity, which is derived from culture, right? You have a culture that comes from a family, and then other families sort of have similar cultures, and that's basically where the culture originates from. It starts with family. And I think the reason why a lot of people have a problem with cultural appropriation is because they may come from a family that sacrificed their culture or their values to adhere to the American way of life, and they feel like they've lost that sense of culture. There's a lot of people, a lot of immigrants that come into America, and they disregard their old values to assimilate themselves, and then you have their kids growing up unexposed to that culture, and then they see other white people appropriating it, and they feel like that's not fair. I should be able to have that culture. I never got that culture, which is a fair argument to say. But blaming people is far from the solution. The solution really is to create a dynamic family that has a strong culture, to where you aren't offended by other people's cultures, so to speak, or people's appropriating other cultures, which is why I feel like I don't feel strongly, and why some people might feel strongly about it and some people don't. I think mostly stems from the families that they're brought into, and I don't think that's related to economic or societal boundaries. I think that's specifically cultural. People who generally come from a very washed out cultural family that doesn't really have a strong dynamic of maintaining family tend to not feel like they are a part of a culture, so to speak, which is debatable, obviously, but that's basically a hypothesis. And I'll touch upon the concept of fetishizing other people's cultures, which I think is a problem. Not to put down those people who fetishize cultures. I think that they're inherently a lot worse off than the people who are criticizing them. I think people who fetishize cultures are in the same boat as the people who feel like their culture has been stolen. They're growing up basically without any culture. They mostly come from suburban neighborhoods, from very whitewashed families, and they look to foreign concepts and foreign cultures to sort of find that grounded, dynamic concept that they are missing from their family lifestyle, that their family did not provide for them. And I think that's an important thing to note, is that they are essentially trying to find a culture. They're trying to find something to relate to identify with, and that ends up being sort of restrictive on their own part. They sort of become a shell of a human being, so as they can sort of find themselves rooted into this culture that necessarily isn't really them. They don't have a strong sense of a personal identity. Their identity comes to another person's culture. This most recent phenomenon is the weeaboo culture, which is a very interesting concept when you think about it. You have a lot of white people, like not all white people, but predominantly white people, just because it's usually from America. Most Americans are white, so that's basically where it comes from. There are plenty of black weeaboos, plenty of Hispanic weeaboos, plenty of Asian weeaboos even, who adhere to the anime, all this adventure, kind of stuff, which is if you watch anime or anything like that, you realize it's a very wholesome sort of experience, right? It sort of takes you out of the mundane reality. It makes things a lot more interesting and also a lot more wholesome. Anime is pretty wholesome in the regards that there's generally the sense of good versus evil. There's generally a protagonist that's generally very powerful, very understanding, for the most part at least. Not all animes are like this, but let's say like Dragon Ball, for instance, is one of the most popular animes in existence, I would argue. You have Goku, who's the epitome of the noble man, so to speak, and he is also a very powerful person. He goes on adventures, he fights, he does all this thing, and I think people attach themselves to those concepts because of their dissatisfaction with reality, which is a very simplistic way to look at it. It makes a lot of sense. It's not anything that complicated, but then they adhere this to the concept of its Japanese culture, its anime. They start fetishizing the concept of what Japan has to offer. And this doesn't happen with just anime, it happens with everything. You have people who get heavily involved in yoga, people heavily involved in like Eastern medicine and all this kinds of stuff. They sort of like sacrifice everything they know about Western civilization and chase after Eastern religion to be a noble truth. And I think that's a reflection of the East versus West sort of dynamic. You have a lot of people in the West now admiring and looking for Eastern solutions to their problems, and you have a lot of people from the East that are adhering to Western philosophy. You see all these Asian countries developing in business and capitalism and growing these huge businesses. In fashion, you see it in music. They're very into hip hop. Like K-pop is a very American style type of creating music. It's definitely something that's very new. That's obviously very popular for a reason. So you have these two dynamic cultures that are sharing from each other. And because they've both come from different places where they had different problems, and they're sort of looking towards the opposite spectrum to find solutions to those problems. And that's happened to me, obviously, coming from a Western point of view and then looking towards the East, looking towards specifically, let's say, Chinese medicine, Chinese thought, Taoism, Buddhism, looking towards those concepts to get a deeper understanding of myself, which I think is a good thing. I think it's good that this is happening in the world. People who say that this is negative, this is cultural appropriation, they're basically, they want to keep things regressed. They want to regress people back downwards into a state. They see that people don't have access to this culture, or their culture was stolen from them. So that means everybody must be on that same level in order for it to be fair, which is not generally the proper way to go about things. If people feel an inclination to study this, then this is the natural way of what people should be doing. Anyway, I've talked a lot about it, and I think we can wrap it up there, and I hope you have a wonderful day.